Number 1.
Australia is known for its beauty. But it's also known as a place where the wildlife can kill you if you aren't careful. Australia is known for its deadly saltwater crocodiles, kangaroos, koala bears, and monstrous sharks. This week I am going to share one of Australia's most infamous crime stories. It involved a murdered man and a tiger shark. On April 17, 1935, Albert Hobson was fishing in the Coogee Beach in Australia. He somehow managed to catch an enormous tiger shark. And since his brother was a proprietor of Australia's Coogee Palace Aquarium, Hobson knew the ideal new home for this shark. It's believed to have been around 12 feet long. The shark was transferred to the aquarium for onlookers to see. On April 25, 1935, aquarium visitors received a jolt. As spectators watched, the large shark vomited up a human arm. Shark experts and local authorities soon arrived to investigate. The arm didn't have any teeth impressions, which meant the shark didn't bite it off. Someone had killed this man and tossed his arm into the ocean. The arm had a tattoo of 2 boxers and intact fingerprints. Authorities released a picture of the arm to the public and asked if anyone could identify it. A man named Edwin Smith came forward. He said his 40-year-old brother Jimmy Smith had vanished on April 8. Edwin confirmed the tattoo was his brother's. Jimmy Smith was a boxer and small-time criminal. After identifying the arm's owner, the police opened a homicide investigation. The search pointed to criminals Patrick Brady and Reggie Holmes. The investigation started with Brady. However, when police arrived at his home, he was gone. He left soon after Smith disappeared. The police then focused on Holmes. They learned Smith, Holmes, and Brady smuggled drugs and committed other crimes together. The police brought Holmes in for questioning. He denied knowing Smith. With no evidence to hold Holmes, the police released him. Holmes then attempted suicide by shooting himself in the head. After surviving his suicide attempt, he cooperated with the police. He claimed Patrick Brady had murdered Jimmy Smith over money. After Brady killed Smith, he cut up the body, placed it in a trunk, and tossed it into the ocean. Brady kept Smith's arm and showed it to Holmes. He blackmailed Holmes and said he would end up like Brady if he didn't pay. Brady then tossed the detached arm into the ocean. A tiger shark then ate the arm. Afterward, a larger tiger shark ate the smaller one. This explained how Jimmy Smith's arm ended up inside a tiger shark. Holmes agreed to testify against Patrick Brady in court. Holmes never lived to see a courtroom. The day before his anticipated testimony, he was found dead inside his car. Someone had fatally shot him. The police didn't know if he committed suicide or if someone murdered him to prevent his testimony. Without Reggie Holmes, the state's case fell apart. In September 1935, a jury acquitted Brady of killing Jimmy Smith. Brady died 30 years after the trial and consistently proclaimed his innocence. With Brady's acquittal, this concluded the notorious shark arm case. So who killed Jimmy Smith? An author named Alex Castles wrote a book titled The Shark Arm Murders. Castles thought a criminal named Eddie Wayman had killed Smith. Wayman was one of Australia's most dangerous men in the 1930s. You definitely didn't want to cross him. It was later discovered that Smith was a police informant. And this may explain why someone murdered Smith. After Brady's acquittal, Australian authorities charged no one else with killing Jimmy Smith. Today, the case remains unsolved.
Number 2.
On January 4, 1935, a 17-year-old boy named Roland T. Owen was murdered mysteriously in Kansas City hotel. The media created many thrilling theories to explain the eerie death of the young man. The hotel staff believed that Owen seemed stressed. A few days later, after checking in the hotel, Owen was found in a dreadful condition in his room with blood everywhere in the room. He was found fatally injured and died a day later. The murder to this day remains unsolved. January 2, 1935, Owen checks in at Hotel President. A man calling himself Roland T. Owen checked in the Hotel President in Kansas City at 1:20 p.m. in room 1046 on Wednesday, January 2, 1935. Witnesses said that he looked around 20 to 35 years old. He had brown hair, a scar on his scalp visible above his ear, and a cauliflower ear. He was dressed in a black coat when the bellboy, Randolph Probst, helped Owen to his room. Probst reported that Owen packed only a toothbrush, comb, and toothpaste. The hotel maid, Mary Soptic, recalled that Owen's room was dimly lit. In a police interrogation, Mary reported he was either worried about something or afraid. At 4 p.m., Soptic returned to Owen's room with fresh towels. She saw Owen sitting calmly on his bed in a full suit in dim lights with the door unlocked. She also saw a notepad that read, "Dawn, I will be back in 15 minutes. Wait." The next day, January 3rd, Soptic came to clean the room at 10:30 a.m. She observed that the door was locked from the outside and assumed that Owen was not in the room. However, Owen was sitting inside the room with the lights off. Soptic thought someone had locked the door from outside. Owen received a call to which he replied, "No, Dawn, I don't want to eat. I am not hungry. I just had breakfast." Owen repeated himself, saying, "No, I am not hungry." Soptic came back at 4 p.m. to deliver fresh towels. She heard two male voices from the room. She knocked on the room and heard a manly voice from inside. The man inquired who was at the door. She said that she came to deliver towels, upon which the man sent her away. January 4, 1935, Owen found dead in his hotel room. The situation got creepier on January 4. The hotel phone operator noticed at 7 a.m. that Owen's phone had been off the hook. He sent Probst, the bellboy, to fix his phone. Probst knocked at his door, but Owen never opened the door. At 8:30 a.m., the hotel management sent another bellboy named Harold Pike into his room. He used the hotel pass key to enter Owen's room. Pike noticed that Owen was lying naked on his bed, seemingly drunk, and the bedding beneath him was dark in color. The bellboy fixed the phone and came back. At 10:30 a.m., Owen's phone was found again disconnected from the hook. Probst went to fix the problem when he found himself in utter horror. He opened the door and saw Owen kneeling on the floor. There was blood everywhere in the room. The walls, ceiling, beddings all were covered in splashes of blood. Randolph freaked out and left the room immediately. The horrific crime scene. Owen was discovered covered in gruesome injuries in his room. A cord had been tightly tied around his neck, wrists, and ankles. It seemed like he had been tortured and strangled. He had been hit repeatedly on his head. His skull was fractured. He was knifed several times in the chest, which punctured his lungs. He had bruises on his neck as a result of strangulation. Surprisingly, he was still alive. One of the detectives arrived early on the scene, asked Owen who did this to him. Upon which he replied that he was alone in his room and he fell against the bathtub. After a brief dialogue exchange, Owen fainted. He was then taken to the hospital. January 5, 1935, tragic death of Roland Owen. On January 5, Owen died from the lethal injuries, leaving behind a long list of questions regarding the case. According to a doctor, the injuries on Owen's body occurred 6 to 7 hours before Owen's death. The autopsy result concluded that the murderer was torturing Owen when his phone was constantly being disconnected from the hook. The investigation begins. The officers scrutinized Owen's room to collect proofs regarding his supposed suicide, as he claimed that nobody came into his room. However, they did not find a weapon that could be used in suicide. Therefore, the suicide theory was ruled out. Shockingly, female fingerprints were found on the telephone in Owen's room. This hint opened the door to multiple new theories. As the case progressed, police found that Roland Owen was faking his name. Owen had told hotel management that he belonged to Los Angeles. However, the Los Angeles authorities denied any records of Roland T. Owen. Many people called the police to check if Owen was someone they lost. In 1936, a woman named Ruby Ogletree identified Owen as her son and told the police that he was Artemus Ogletree and not Roland T. Owen. Artemus had sent Ruby 3 letters before his death. Ruby claimed that the letters did not seem familiar with Artemis's writing tone. The police also found that Mrs. Ogletree stayed in Kansas City during the murder of her child, which further tangled the case. Possible murderer sends an anonymous message soon after Artemis's death the burial authorities received a random call. A man insisted that they bury Artemis in the Memorial Park Cemetery. He promised to cover all expenses of Artemis's funeral. On March 23, 1935, an anonymous sender delivered flowers and money wrapped in newspaper to the funeral home. A card accompanied the flowers and money which read, "Love forever, Louise." Murder Theory 1. The investigators deduced a theory that the person named Don had a conflict with Artemis. He killed Artemis and ran away with it. The police also believed that Mrs. Ogletree and Don lived briefly in Kansas City together when Artemis was killed. Murder Theory 2. The second theory resulted from the hotel's elevator operator, Charles Blocker's interrogation. Blocker claimed that he saw a young woman looking for room number 1026. However, she seemed confused and she might have mixed room 1026 with room 1046. Blocker also said that he saw the lady with a man later, which could have been Dawn. Female fingerprints were found in Artemis's room. The young lady and Dawn might have killed Artemis and left the hotel. Murder Theory 3. The third theory had been the most popular among people. Investigators believed that Artemis had been cheating on his fiancée, and in a fit of rage, his fiancée ended up killing him with the help of her brother. The anonymous person who was ready to fund Artemis's funeral requested the burial authorities to bury Artemis in the Memorial Park Cemetery as it would be near his sister's home. The police linked this man with Artemis's mysterious murder. Conclusion. Artemis Ogletree's murder remains a mystery to this date. There was not enough proof to convict anyone. However, many people believe that Ogletree's murder was a result of his infidelity in his relationship.
Number 3.
A marriage and a honeymoon should be happy times. Indeed, this is usually one of the happiest times in a person's life. Meeting, falling in love, dreaming of the future together, for many it doesn't get any better. Yet, sometimes things don't go quite as planned, dreams are dashed, and it all unravels. There can be few occasions in which it is unraveled quite so spectacularly as the story of two star-crossed lovers who went on a peaceful honeymoon to a secluded cottage, only to have it all devolve into madness, conspiracies, strange events, and a mysterious death that has gone unsolved to this day. It all began happily enough. In 1947, a 22-year-old Toronto woman by the name of Christina Macon was in love. She had met war veteran John Ray Kettlewell, called Jack by pretty much everyone, 3 years previously, and the two had had a whirlwind romance that had now come to talk of marriage, yet the fact that her parents opposed to the whole relationship from the start presented a bit of a hurdle to overcome. After trying to change her parents' minds and failing, the two decided to let their love be the guide, deciding to get married anyway. Christina then ran away from her family and her job to elope with John on May 12, 1947, after which they went off on their honeymoon. Oddly, they did not depart alone, as Jack's best friend, a professional ballroom dancer by the name of Ronald Berry, tagged along. Indeed, Berry was often with the couple wherever they went, something that had disturbed and creeped out Christina's family, with her sister later saying, "When Jack and Christina got married, we thought it was very strange that Berry went along on the honeymoon. That's what made us wonder if Ronnie was also in love with Chris." No matter what the family thought, or how creepy it might seem to most, for Christina and Jack it was normal business as usual, and after spending a few days at an apartment in Toronto they headed out to a wilderness cottage Berry owned in Severn Falls, Ontario on May 17 with Berry in tow for reasons only known to them. The cottage was so remote that it could only be reached by boat, but it might have seemed quaint and romantic if it weren't for the fact that Jack's friend was creepily never far away, always hanging about, as well as the strange events that would begin to play out. It started with Christina acting very strangely and out of character, sometimes going into a bizarre, dazed state, and other times throwing fits of hysterics or crying for no reason. This was already fairly strange, but on May 20 things would get even weirder. On this day, Berry left the couple alone in order to go out and do some sunbathing at the riverside. He would claim that when he left, John and Christina had seemed to be in good spirits and acting normally. There was no reason at all to think that it wouldn't be just another peaceful day, yet when Berry returned the cottage was on fire. He frantically searched the premises for his friends and found Jack just calmly sitting in the living room, as if nothing was happening, even as the blaze spread around them. A closer inspection showed that he had sustained a head wound and seemed to be in some sort of dazed, disorientated stupor. Barry asked where Christina was, but Jack didn't seem to be able to respond, and a full search of the steadily burning cottage turned up no sign of her. Barry then got Jack to the hospital, where it was found that he had a head wound, minor burns, and signs of drugs in his system. By the time authorities reached the scene of the blaze, the cottage had almost completely burned down, yet there was still no sign of Christina. Police scoured the area looking for her, but there was no trace, as if she had just disappeared into thin air. It would not be until 3 days later that her fate would be known, when her dead body was discovered lying face down in a shallow pool at the river by a boathouse owner named Neville Sweet. She was found just 150 feet from the cottage, dressed in floral patterned pajamas, and her body seemed to be in a pristine state, showing no signs of burns from the fire and no outward signs of injury or violence. An autopsy would turn up no drugs in her system, except trace amounts of cotton, and the official cause of death was given as drowning. But how had this happened? What had happened to Jack and Christine in the time between when Barry left that cottage and came back to find Jack wounded and dazed and the cottage on fire? How had Christina gotten out in her pajamas to end up dead in that river? Even stranger, why is it that one of the men who had tried to put out the fire would later report that he had passed that same area of the river earlier and seen no body? Had she just wandered around the woods for a while before somehow ending up dead? No one knew, and it was about to get even more confusing and indeed more sinister. A full investigation of the incident began, and an inquest was launched to decide if there had been foul play involved, which drew a great amount of media attention and publicity at the time, and would also turn up a lot of strange things. It was found that Jack himself had no real memory of that day, perhaps due to his head injury, and in the end most of the scrutiny fell directly on Ronald Barry. There were quite a few suspicious things that turned up about Barry during the inquest. For one, he was the beneficiary of 2 life insurance policies for both Christina and Jack worth $5,000 each, a substantial amount of money at the time, and what's more, the policies offered a double payout if there was an accidental death involved. On top of this, Barry had taken out a good deal of insurance on the cottage. An expensive engagement ring worth a lot of money had never been found, and Jack had listed Barry as the main beneficiary of his will. It really looks pretty ominous in light of Jack being found drugged and dazed in a burning cottage and Christina found dead by apparent drowning, as it sure does seem that Ronald Barry stood to have made a whole heap of money if she had died accidentally and Jack had also gone down with the house. But wait, it all gets stranger still. Jack would also claim to have had an illicit affair with Barry, only later to recant the admission and claim that he had been coerced into saying it. There were also produced suicide notes allegedly written by Christina before the elopement and judged by experts to be in her handwriting, in which she expressed wanting to die rather than lose Jack to another woman. The notes had been written to Barry back in April of that year, but this was all news to Jack himself, meaning that his friend had kept this information secret from him. Another note was even eerier, as it was written just a day before her disappearance and death, addressed to a Mrs. Thomas and explaining her intentions to kill herself. Barry knew about this note as well, as he was the one who had been tasked with actually sending it, but he did not say anything about this to Jack. Why not? No one really knows. Indeed, we don't really know the answers to most of the many questions brought up during the inquest because it was never able to be decided whether foul play had been at work or not. With no concrete evidence to prove this was anything other than a string of accidents, misfortune, and suicide, in the end neither Jack nor Barry were pursued as possible perpetrators any further, and the whole case was dropped. Not everyone was convinced, though, and there was the pervasive opinion that Barry was behind it all. Even the special Crown Counsel at the inquest, a C.P. Hope, minced no words when he described Barry as a liar of the most blatant kind, whose sinister figure permeates the whole of this tragedy, but whose purpose and design are shrouded in mystery. The whole mystery only deepens further when in 1956, Barry suddenly vanished without a trace, leaving behind a Pekingese dog as a gift for Jack's then 2-year-old son and his new wife. Barry has never been seen again. Does this have anything to do with the case? It is unknown. Interestingly, Jack never mentioned any of it to his second wife, Sharon, and she had no idea about it until she stumbled across articles on it on microfilm at the library. It is unknown why he never told her and decided to keep it a secret, and he would take it to his grave in 1998. And that is the frustrating state of this case, a lot of unknowns and very few solid answers. What in the world was going on here? Was this all a simple suicide and accidents as they say, or was there something more nefarious going on? Was this a murder based on some insurance fraud or a love triangle gone awry? What are we to make of all of the strange circumstances and clues orbiting it all? The case of the 8-day bride has officially been written off for some time, but the myriad oddities involved have managed to convince many that all is not what it seems, and the case continues to be hotly discussed and debated to this day.
Number 4.
Jimmy Hoffa was a prominent labor leader and fierce union organizer starting in the late 1930s and up through the 1960s. He rose through the ranks of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters to become its president, was eventually jailed and barred from participating in union activities as a condition of a commutation by President Richard Nixon. On July 30, 1975 he disappeared while waiting to meet with business associates who were well-known mafia figures. He was officially declared dead by a Michigan probate court in 1982, and the mystery surrounding his disappearance has gone unsolved and has been turned into numerous books and 2 major motion picture films. One recent film was The Irishman. All these works, except for a handful of scholarly publications, have largely relied on suspects whose accounts have long since been debunked, leaving mystery and intrigue in their wake. At the time, there were many allegations of corruption within the Teamsters Union and its close ties with the mafia. Jimmy Hoffa famously squared off with Senate counsel and later Attorney General Robert Kennedy during Senate and Justice Department investigations into labor management and organized crime. Their feud was public. Hoffa was called to testify under oath before Senate hearings in 1957. Caught in a famous photograph from those hearings, Hoffa is subtly giving Robert Kennedy the middle finger. Jimmy Hoffa was not a made man, an official member of the Sicilian Mafia, lacking the genetic pedigree required of its membership, but nonetheless his activities and interactions with the organization were representative of a very intimate association. Specifically, he often worked with organized crime when it was to the advantage of the union and its members. Although Hoffa was credited with keeping the mafia in check regarding union matters, Jack Goldsmith, a Hoffa scholar and Harvard law professor, argues that Robert Kennedy's assailing of Jimmy Hoffa in the 1960s and his eventual conviction and jail sentence unintentionally enabled organized crime to garner greater control of the Teamsters and its pension fund. When Jimmy Hoffa attempted to return to the Union presidency following his release from jail, it is believed the mafia did not want him back in control given Jimmy's tighter grip on the Union's business and its pension fund. Jimmy also threatened to expose the mob's connections to the Union and its use of the pension funds for loans that were beneficial to its corrupt plans and goals. As such, the mafia set about plans to eliminate Jimmy Hoffa. This fact pattern is of interest to contemporary scholars and crescendos around one critical question: who were the chief suspects and likely culprits? There are as many theories about the people behind the murder as there are stars in the sky. In this paper, I assert that using objective data and applying social network analysis, a mathematical framework, can clarify the dynamics of a network engaged in conspiracy-based crimes. Academic literature is rife with examples of identifying cell leaders within terrorist networks or post-mortems on Enron using social network analysis. But this may be one of the first academic papers to apply social network analysis to an unsolved cold case to identify key conspirators. The first hurdle in executing this analysis was the lack of an objective dataset on Hoffa and his associated mafia network. As such, I generated a dataset that would be useful in social network analysis (SNA) modeling using 3 disparate and authoritative sources from The Federal Bureau of Investigation's Hoffa case file, and made available to the public through the Freedom of Information Act. The published book of a law school professor with direct ties, knowledge, and familiarity with the suspects in the case, and the published work of a journalist who is considered a leading expert on the mafia in Detroit, where Jimmy Hoffa disappeared and held most of his business interactions. As such, the paper draws upon 3 authoritative sources from top-notch scholarly and professional investigative work on the Hoffa disappearance. It then uses the power of mathematics and social network analysis on data from these sources to re-examine a cold case, probably a first-ever use of social network analysis for this purpose. This approach and methodology will help us place a spotlight on the likely culprits involved in the conspiracy to kidnap and murder Jimmy Hoffa. Findings: an analysis of the Jimmy Hoffa network generated from data I developed from an FBI 1978 70-page chronology of events, Harvard law professor Jack Goldsmith's book In Hoffa's Shadow, and Scott Bernstein's book Motor City Mafia, suggests that 3 men are at the center of gravity in the disappearance and murder of Jimmy Hoffa. All 3 men were members of Sicilian organized crime groups, 1 in Detroit and 2 in New Jersey. All 3 men were FBI key suspects at one time or another in the Hoffa investigation. One suspect in particular had business dealings with Hoffa and stood to lose financially if Hoffa returned to power as president in the Teamsters Union. Additionally, one of the men was shot and killed on the street in New York City's Little Italy, possibly for cooperating with the FBI about the Hoffa disappearance in exchange for a plea deal in a separate case of a mafia-involved killing. The 3 men are Anthony Tony Pro Provenzano, a mobster from New Jersey who frequently borrowed money from the Teamsters pension fund, Salvador Sally Bugs Brigaglio, a mobster from New Jersey who was Tony Pro's hitman, and finally Anthony Tony Jack Giacalone, a Detroit mobster who was an associate of Hoffa. All 3 were pursued by the FBI and the U.S. Department of Justice in the Hoffa investigation, but asserted their Fifth Amendment right from self-incrimination during a Detroit federal grand jury investigation into the Hoffa disappearance. The social network analysis metrics of all 3 men were the highest of anyone within the network, suggesting the 3 men are likely to have had intimate knowledge of the disappearance, even if they were not personally involved in the abduction. All 3 men are now deceased.
Number 5.
Over 30 years ago, at 1:24 a.m. on March 18, 1990, 2 men dressed as police officers walked into the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. 81 minutes later they walked out with $200 million worth of artwork, now valued at $500 million. They forced the night guards into the basement and duct-taped their hands, eyes, and ankles. The guards were not discovered until the new shift came to relieve them around 8 a.m. When the police examined the gallery, they noticed that the missing paintings had been cut from the frames instead of carefully removed. None of the pieces have ever been recovered. 13 pieces were stolen from the museum. The value of the pieces makes this the biggest art theft in the history of the world. Click on any of the images below to see a larger version and learn more. The museum is offering $10 million in reward money for information leading to the recovery of the stolen items. If you have verifiable information about the location of any of these items, please contact the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum Security Chief Anthony M. Moore at reward@gardnermuseum.org. The case has puzzled crime solvers for years. How did the thieves know where the timed security alarm printouts were? How did they know when the alarm went off in the museum that it wouldn't alert the police? The average art heist takes 10 minutes. So, why did they take so long? Why were they confident enough to take 2 trips to their car? In 2015, the FBI has stated they believe they know who committed the robbery, George Riesfelder and Leonardo DiMuzio. But both Riesfelder and DiMuzio died within a year of the heist. The FBI believed the art was transported to Connecticut and Philadelphia through organized crime connections to try to sell the items on the black market. But after those attempted transactions, there hasn't been a trace. Evidence suggests that the Italian mob in Boston was behind the theft. Riesfelder and DiMuzio were known associates of the now deceased mobster Carmelo Merlino. At the time, organized crime members seemed excited about the idea that they could trade a stolen painting in exchange for no jail time if they were ever caught doing more unsavory business. But several of them did get caught, and no one seemed to know anything about the artwork. Several others died not too long after the heist and seemed to have taken their secrets to the grave. Even with the $10 million reward for the safe return of the items, no one has come forward with credible information. Isabella Stewart Gardner famously stipulated in her will that nothing in the museum galleries should be permanently changed. No new items should be bought, nor should any items be sold. So, for now, those frames hang empty in the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, a reminder of the still missing artwork. The whole thing is a puzzling mystery, and no one seems to have any fresh leads. Some people think the items are hiding in someone's attic. Others think the pieces have left the country and are hiding in a rich oligarch's house. Many believe the pieces are separated and are not all together. What do you think?
Number 6.
It has been 40 years since what is known as the Keddie murders took place in rural Plumas County. It's a case that involves a triple slaying and a missing child whose remains were later found. The case remains cold. "This thing was planned to a certain degree," said former Plumas County Sheriff on the site of State Route 70, on the way to Quincy, a rickety wooden building with boarded-up windows stands. It is labeled Keddie Resort. It's a marker for people driving this route daily and also a marker in the community. The horror happened at the Keddie Resort and Cabin 28 on April 11, 1981. Sheila Sharp, 14, spent the night next door to her home in Cabin 28 with a friend for a sleepover. She came home to change clothes for church when she discovered 3 bodies inside covered in blood. She would later learn the victims were her mother, Glenna Sue Sharp, her brother, John Sharp, and her brother's friend, Dana Wingate. Not only did Sheila Sharp make a traumatizing and gruesome discovery, but she also discovered her other siblings, Greg and Ricky, and their friend Justin Smart, were unharmed in a spare bedroom. A hammer and knife were recovered at the scene, believed to be murder weapons. Investigators later determined someone was missing from the home, Sheila's 12-year-old sister Tina Sharp. It was believed she was abducted. Articles were written in the Feather River Bulletin newspaper, but Tina was not found. You kill 3 people in a cabin, and you leave the remains there to be discovered. I think Tina was absolutely central to why this happened. I think there was something about Tina that could not be left there to be discovered. It's my strong sense that there's something about Tina that did not allow for her to be left there, said former Plumas County Sheriff Greg Hagwood. Meanwhile, sketches of possible suspects were released to the public based on Justin Smart's recollections of that deadly night. Smart was found in the spare bedroom and gave conflicting stories, saying both that he witnessed the murders and was dreaming. Then, on April 22, 1984, a little more than 3 years after the murders, someone collecting bottles in the woods in rural Butte County, about 100 miles from Keddie, found human remains. The remains belonged to Tina Sharp. Shortly after news broke of the discovery, a mysterious phone call came into the Butte County Sheriff's office. "I was watching the news and they were talking about the girl found at Feather Falls. I was just wondering if you thought of the murder up in Keddie. In Plumas County a couple years ago, where a 12-year-old girl was never found," the unidentified caller said. Whoever made the call knew something specific about what happened at Keddie. This call wasn't investigated initially as it was left in evidence for Detective Mike Gamberg to find. "We found evidence that was never brought forward by the officers and Department of Justice," Detective Gamberg said about his frustration with the early investigation of the case. Spanning the investigation, investigators named 2 primary suspects, Martin Smart, a neighbor to the Sharps, and his friend John Bo Boobad. Martin Smart initially told investigators he was missing a hammer. That hammer was found in 2016 in a pond down the road from where Cabin 28 once stood. Investigators believe it was intentionally placed there. Smart fled Keddie after the murders. Another red flag. And what may be even more telling is what he wrote in a letter to his then-wife Marilyn. "I've paid the price of your love, and now I've bought it with 4 people's lives." Martin Smart died in 2006. John Boobad died in 1988. But are there others involved? Detectives tell ABC 10 they believe more people have a guilty conscience. "I believe there are two individuals that are alive and accessories after the fact," Gamberg said. Gamberg and Hagwood say they are closer now to solving this case than ever before. "I think it would lift an incredible weight to clear the dark skies that have hung over that community and the surviving family members," Hagwood said. "The surviving family members have been severely impacted by this case. Things came to an abrupt screeching halt. Opportunities and experiences that were denied by such a cruel, heinous act. It's unforgivable," Hagwood said. "To solve this case, a weight would be lifted. Darkness would no longer cloud Keddie and the minds of all those involved. I believe in one way, shape or form we are going to pull this together," Detective Gamberg said. "Anyone with information is asked to call the Plumas County Sheriff's Office at 530-283-6360.
Number 7.
There are few Hollywood mysteries more enduring and heartbreaking than the tragic death of actress Natalie Wood. In the early morning hours of November 29, 1981, the lifeless body of the big screen icon was found floating off the shore of Catalina Island, a mile away from her husband's yacht, Splendor. Wearing nothing but a nightgown, wool socks, and a down jacket, Natalie had drowned, and the circumstances surrounding her death, as well as her husband's involvement in it, remain cloaked in mystery to this day. Thanksgiving, 1981. Natalie decided to spend the 1981 Thanksgiving weekend with a trip to Catalina Island together with her husband, fellow actor Robert Wagner, aboard his 55-foot yacht. The couple was joined by Wood's Brainstorm co-star Christopher Walken and the ship's captain, Dennis Davern. Wood and Walken were in the process of filming the sci-fi film, which is probably why he was invited to the trip. On November 28, the foursome enjoyed a champagne-filled afternoon and dinner at Doug's Harbor Reef, a restaurant in Catalina, before going back to the yacht for the evening. The night manager at the restaurant later recalled that all four looked too intoxicated, and he was worried they might not board the boat safely from their dinghy. He even asked Harbor Patrol to accompany the group to their yacht, which happened at around 10:30 p.m. Merely half an hour later, at around 11:05 p.m., after everyone had made it safely to the Splendor, the men realized that Natalie and the dinghy were both missing. For some unknown reason, they notified the Coast Guard of Wood's disappearance nearly 4 hours later, at 3:30 a.m. This part of the timeline has been of particular interest to police, and both Wagner and Davern's recollection of events has changed over the years. At 8 a.m. on the morning of November 29, the Coast Guard found Natalie's body about a mile south of the yacht near Blue Cavern Point. The dinghy was reportedly not far from where they found her. Initial medical report, November 30, 1981. Dr. Joseph Choi was the deputy medical examiner who performed the autopsy. The results showed that Natalie had a blood alcohol content of 0.14% at the time of her death. There were bruises on her left cheek, arms, and legs, which the examiner considered to be consistent with a fall overboard while the actress was presumably trying to board the dinghy. After a 2-week investigation, Dr. Choi ruled the death an accident, stating that Natalie had been drinking prior to her disappearance and may have slipped and drowned while trying to get into the dinghy. When asked by the police, Wagner told investigators that he and Walken had been engaged in political debate and, bored, Wood had decided to go to bed before him. It was when he went to bed later in the evening that he realized Natalie was gone. He assumed she may have taken the dinghy out in the water as he claimed she had previously done. However, when she didn't return, he got worried. That, plus the coroner's conclusion, and the case was quickly closed. Reopening the case, November 17, 2011. Exactly 30 years after her death, the Lee County Sheriff's Department reopened Natalie's case in light of additional information received from unidentified sources. A day later, the yacht's captain, Dennis Davern, appeared in an interview for NBC's Today Show and admitted that he had lied to the police when he was initially questioned about the night of Natalie's death. He claimed that it was actually Wagner who was responsible for the tragedy without clarifying how. According to him, and based on a March 2000 interview Davern did for Vanity Fair, Wood and Walken had been flirting throughout the day and Wagner was getting increasingly jealous. After dinner, when they got back to the Splendor, the two men got into a fight. Wagner allegedly even threw a wine bottle and yelled at Walken, "What are you trying to do, FK my wife?" Davern said that's when Natalie left the room embarrassed by her husband's actions and that Wagner followed her into her room. Husband and wife, as Davern remembered it, had an epic fight and Natalie was never seen again. The captain also remembered hearing the dinghy being untied and that Wagner was sweating profusely when he returned. Walken had already gone to bed and so Wagner and Davern stayed up for a few more drinks. At around 1:30 a.m., the actor said he will go check on his wife. When he returned, he notified Davern that Natalie was missing. Naturally, the captain suggested turning on the searchlights to see if they can locate her in the dinghy, but, Davern said, Wagner didn't allow him to. Davern was left with the feeling that Wagner wasn't very keen on trying to find his wife. After further investigation, the coroner's office officially changed Natalie's death certificate from accidental drowning to drowning and other undetermined factors in 2012. Months later, the law coroner's office released a 10-page addendum to the autopsy stating that some of Natalie's bruises may have been inflicted before she got into the water. If you're curious about Walken's version of events, don't be. He hired a lawyer once the case was reopened, collaborated with authorities, and was cleared of all suspicion. He only ever broke his silence in a 1997 interview for Playboy magazine. The actor said that he believes Natalie must have slipped, given the logistics of the boat, the rain, and the darkness of the night. What happened that night, he said, is something only Natalie can know, because she was alone out there. Wagner becomes a person of interest, 2018. In February 2018, the Lee County Sheriff's Department gave a press conference where investigators told reporters that Robert Wagner, then 88 years old, was now a person of interest in Natalie Wood's case. Lieutenant John Carina shared with the press that investigators no longer believed the theory that Natalie would try to go into town in her nightgown at midnight by herself while it's raining outside, there's no visibility, and the waters are pretty rough. Another detective, Ralph Hernandez, gave an interview for CBS News and said that even though police haven't been able to prove Natalie was killed, they also haven't been able to prove her death was an accident either. The ultimate problem, he said, was that investigators couldn't determine how she ended up in the water. Hernandez also said that, upon reviewing her autopsy reports, Natalie looked like the victim of an assault. It's reported that Wagner was no longer interested in talking to the police about his wife's death. Wagner's version of events. Wagner is still alive and well at 91, and he has continuously claimed his innocence throughout the investigation. In the 1986 book Heart to Heart with Robert Wagner, the actor offered his theory on the accidental death of his wife. He believed that she tried to tighten the dinghy as it was banging against the yacht and preventing her from falling asleep. He theorized that Natalie must have slipped and fallen into the water, thus hitting her head while trying to tighten the line. Interestingly enough, this isn't what Wagner initially told police. He admitted to arguing with his wife on the night of her disappearance about Natalie spending a lot of time away from the family, working. That's just one of the many inconsistencies in his story throughout the years. Keep in mind that Wood and Wagner were on their second marriage to each other. Yes, to each other. They first married in 1957, when Natalie was just 19 years old. That marriage lasted for just 4 years, and they formally divorced in 1962. A decade and several relationships with other people later, they married again. It was widely believed that their second marriage was one of the most solid in Hollywood, and that Natalie was a caring and loving wife and mother. Fear of dark waters. After the initial investigation concluded that Natalie's death was accidental drowning because she either wanted to take the dinghy out into the waters or slipped while trying to tighten the line, many people who were close to her disagreed. When she was just a little girl, a fortune teller told her mother that Natalie will die in dark waters. After a series of water-related accidents as a child, one of which resulted in a broken wrist and near drowning, Natalie became terrified of water. That's why the theory that she willingly decided to take the dinghy in the cold rough waters or get anywhere near it alone seems unlikely. Walken himself said that Natalie had shared her fear of water with him and that she couldn't swim. Directors even had to cut a swimming scene from their joint film Brainstorm because of that. The child star from the Christmas classic Miracle on 34th Street, 1947, grew into a woman everyone loved on and off screen. And, in a way, her co-star Christopher Walken is right. Only she knows what really happened to her in the wee hours of November 29, 1981. The investigation is still open, but many of the leads have gone cold. Who knows if we'll ever know what happened to Natalie Wood.